I, as you know, do not really need a microphone, as you can tell, and so I won't use one except for him. That has wired me up. But I'm really glad to have this opportunity because I think this whole area of aging and sexuality is one that's been totally overlooked and one that is not really valued or understood in the society. And when I was thinking about coming today, I had recently seen a cartoon. And this is a cartoon of an older man and older woman. They're sitting on a park bench, and the man's reading a publication that says seniors having sex. And so he says to the woman, why can't we go back to my apartment? And she responds, because you can't remember where it is. And then I read an interview with older people about their sexual life, and this man said, you know, when we're older, we're supposed to be asexual. And then if we refuse to be, then we get labeled as dirty old men. And so I think that these two things really point up the fact that this is really an ageist society. And so the whole idea of sexuality and aging is something that, you know, people don't even want to talk about. And when they use the word sex, they very often are talking about sexual intercourse. And we'll talk some about that. But I want to define what I'm talking about when I'm talking about sexuality. And I like the World Health Organization definition that sexuality is the central of our being from the day we're born until the day that we die. And it encompasses a wide range of things. It encompasses gender, it encompasses sexual orientation, it encompasses sexual roles, pleasure, eroticism, reproduction. So it's a very, very broad definition of what it means to be a sexual human being. And so when we go and just think about sex as being something for intercourse, we really, really don't understand the whole broad issue of sexuality. And also, you see, when we think about our culture and what our culture thinks about this whole area, you know, again, we get back to this whole thing. Well, if we are focused on the word sex being for sexual intercourse, then, you know, we think, well, then we have this idea too that it's for only procreation and for only the young and beautiful. Now, there are some young people here, and there are some beautiful people here, but some of us aren't young and beautiful, and there's no way we're going to become young and beautiful anymore, of course. And so it really does limit our understanding of what happens to people and to us all. And this is one of the real critical issues. Although some of you are still young and beautiful, you will not always be. And so it's why it's important to be aware of this whole broader issue. I'm thinking, wondering what you think are some of the stereotypes that people have about sexuality and aging. What comes to your mind when you think about what you think most people in the society may think about?
People don't have sex when they get
older. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, people don't have sex. And one of the things, I mean, everybody knows that people say, Melanie, don't you know, as we get older, the body parts wear out, sexual desire goes away. You don't want to have any sexual expression. Don't you know that, Melanie? No, Melanie doesn't know that because that's not right. And what else do you think about when you think most people consider sexuality and aging? Well, one of the things people hear about is sexual dysfunction. So they think, well, if you have sexual dysfunction, it's all over, forget it, That is also wrong, wrong, wrong. I mean, most of the ideas that people have about sexuality and aging are very wrong ideas, just because we don't talk about it much in this society, and we don't want somebody like me going around bringing it up all the time. Well, honestly, I'm of the opinion, you see, that lots more people ought to be bringing it up, especially people like doctors and other healthcare providers who don't ever bring it up. And so what else? Do you think of any other kind of thing that people commonly think about when they think about people getting older? Yes, John.
With my own 4 daughters when they were little, when we were in our 20s and 30s, we were old.
Yeah.
already to them. So
Yeah.
the idea of any intimacy or closeness was kind of a ew.
Yeah.
Ew.
Yeah.
And that sort of ew
Yeah.
for young people and now even older young people into their seeing the idea.
Oh yeah, just the idea, just the idea. And what you're saying is one of the things that we'll come back and talk again. Some of the biggest pains around this subject are adult children. Adult children sticking their nose in their parents' business, or thinking that my parents have sex, or my mother wants to have sex, or my father. I mean, somebody who told me about their father moved to a retirement community down in Florida, and while he was unloading his car, had arrived there about 5 minutes before, 3 women came over to introduce themselves to him and to get acquainted and see if there's any help he needed, that sort of thing. And so the idea, that our parents are sexual, or our grandparents are sexual, is an idea that some people cannot allow themselves to think about. But then people say, well, Melanie, if you're going to insist on this, at least be grateful that we don't have to worry about pregnancy, STDs, STIs, HIV. Wrong again. This is terrible, all the misperceptions that people have. We don't have to worry about pregnancy, that's for sure. My secretary is 87 years old, and I'm so glad because I don't have to worry about her taking maternity leave or anything like that. But, so in any event, as an employer, you have a sort of a different view about that. But in any event, these are some of the ideas that we have in the society that has made it harder to even begin to have some understanding of this. But as social workers, of course, you're going to have lots of opportunities. I know some of you work senior centers, some of you home health, and so forth and so on, that you're going to encounter senior citizens, and you'll be in a position actually to be very helpful to them. Well, okay, so we're going to say that people are sexual all their lives, but there are some barriers to expressing one sexually as one ages. What do you think some of the barriers might be? Yeah, Francie. Yeah.
Well, I think the biggest barrier is the cultural norm. You're supposed to, at different stages of life, people are supposed to behave in different ways. And after a certain age, which is always 10, whatever you are, you're not supposed to. Mm-hmm. I think that movies, as I was saying before, movies like Mamma Mia and Marigold Hotel have done something to have a teeny impact in society. But I think the cultural norm is very powerful.
Yeah. Even this whole thing of people think, well, what will people think of me? If they know that I'm going to do some online dating, I'm 70 years old, what will people think of me? Well, I learned something about that a long time ago. Most people don't think anything about you. They're so self-absorbed with their own lives and their own problems and, this sort of thing. They don't really think about you, so get over it, I can remember learning that lesson. I was very glad I learned it when I was young. When I was young, my parents didn't, thank goodness, but parents used to tell their children, you've got to come home by the curfew, 9 or 10 o'clock, whatever it was, because if you come in late, what will the neighbors think? The neighbors will just think, you're turning to a terrible teenager and we're awful parents and, what's all this going to be? Well, one night I was up late and I was doing my homework, and so I was finished, and I thought, I'm going to go out and see what the neighbors are doing. So I went outside and I went down, I went all around the block, and I came all the way back. Not a light to be seen. And I realized the neighbors were all asleep. They weren't up looking to see if I was coming home late or anybody else was coming home late. The neighbors wouldn't think anything. And most of the time now, this is true, that nobody's going to think anything about you. There are some barriers, obviously, that occur, and a lot of them are physical barriers. For example, issues as people age, sometimes diseases that occur, certain kinds of diseases like arthritis, things like that may interfere with people being comfortable and moving, certain kinds of diseases that require medications. anti-arrhythmia medicines, antihypertensive medicines, diabetes, those sorts of things. And that's one of the things to inquire about if you're talking with people about a change in their feeling, is simply what medications are they on? Because some of the medications have the side effect of decreasing libido and creating a problem. And sometimes they can be changed, sometimes they can't, but there are other ways to work around it. So there are some barriers, and one of the things that I think is there's some differences in men and women in the kinds of difficulties that they have as they age. And one of the things that you see more often with women is low self-esteem that develops as people age, and particularly for women. And you can understand it. Our bodies change as we get older, and then you look around and you see young and beautiful people, and you can remember when you used to be young and beautiful, maybe, and you can think, well, so you don't feel so good about yourself, and so you begin to think, well, nobody would want to be interested in me or to have any kind of relationship with me. So that's a really big problem women have, I think, more than men. Also, the physiology of sometimes women have more of a problem with dryness, and this is difficult, but it doesn't need to be, And so these are sorts of things are really problematic psychologically. People think, well, that if people don't want to have a relationship with them, they feel very rejected and so forth. But these are all things that can be dealt with. They have, and so aging itself is not the issue, but it's some of these other kinds of things. One of the things, of course, with men is the common problem with men is erectile dysfunction. And again, we certainly all know the cure for that. Every day I get an offer to buy Viagra. I'm sure most of you do too, whether you need it or not. And then you see all of these things on television, Cialis. I don't even know what the names of them are. And some of them sound really quite interesting, because this one for Cialis, I know I've listened to it, says, if you have an erection that lasts more than 4 hours, call your doctor. Call your doctor. Call the newspaper. What is the problem here? That this is some terrible kind of things, but they're very commonly used, and they've been really very helpful to men, who are having the problem. Well, so we're talking about the fact that adults do want to have sexual relationships, and they do want to express their sexuality. And so exactly what are the facts about it? Well, there have been some studies now that have been done that really do give us a totally different idea than some people have about it. There was a study that was published, I think, in about 2007 in the New England Journal of Medicine, and this was a very interesting study. It was a national study, over 3,000 men and women, ages 61 to 85, and it was overpopulated with minorities to be sure that they had enough included. So what they discovered was that 73% of people who were 55 to 85, 55 to 64, 73% were sexually active. Then when you got to 65 to 75, it was like 37% were sexually active. And then when you got 75 to 85, it dropped down to 25% were sexually active. And we know that there are people who are 100 years old who are still sexually active. So the fact is that whether we think that this happens or not, it does happen. And people are sexually active and want to be able to express their sexuality. One of the things that we also know is that people have sex as they get older in different places. Sometimes people still live in their home, they have the privacy of their home, but in assisted living facilities, in nursing homes, in retirement communities, those are all places that are where you have people who are active and sexually active, and so it's a very interesting thing. One of the common things too, though, is that we were talking about some of the societal ideas. Is that people have the idea, for example, if you begin to develop memory loss, that's for sure at the end. You know, you no longer have any sort of interest in sexual things. That is not true. That is absolutely not true. One of the interesting examples of this was Justice Sandra Day O'Connor when she was on the Supreme Court. The reason she resigned from the Supreme Court was that her husband had developed dementia, and he was a lawyer, and he would come to the court and, you know, sit in for 2 or 3 years. But as dementia progressed, that she felt like she really wanted to go back to Arizona and take him back to Arizona where their sons lived, and so she resigned from the court and they moved back to Arizona. And he went to live in an assisted living facility. And she talks about this, and she said, you know, after he'd been there for a while, 3 or 4 months, and she went to visit him one day, and he brought up this woman, and he was holding her hand, and he introduced her as his friend, and so forth, and he had gotten acquainted with her. People had said to Justice O'Connor, oh, weren't you just awful, you know, how could he do this? And she said, I am very happy that he had found someone there, a person he could eat lunch with, a person he could talk to, a person he could hold hands with, you know. And I'm sure there came a day when he didn't probably know her even, or certainly didn't understand what wife meant, you know. But she was happy for him because it added a lot to the quality of his life. And I think this is one of the things we need to understand too, is that the expression of sexuality in older adulthood, it does add to the quality of people's life. You know, it's psychologically fulfilling, it makes them feel better, and so this is the sort of thing that happened. Now, one of the things that I think we're in danger of course, is having some serious problems with people in assisted living facilities and in nursing homes, because a lot of these facilities do not have policies regarding people's rights as they are in these facilities. The Hebrew Home for the Aged, which is in the Bronx, New York, has the model of that, in that they have developed very interesting policies and guidelines for their staff in terms of the sexual preferences and expression of their patients. There was a very interesting case that I think was finally settled in the end of 2014, and this involved a man who was a member of the legislature in the state of Kansas, and his wife, and she was in a assisted living. And excuse me, they had been married about 7 years. It was a second marriage, where both of them had been widowed. And he went every day, twice a day, to see her, and you know, they spent time together, and the staff talked about how, you know, devoted they were to each other and so forth. But she had 3 daughters from a previous marriage. And before they had married, and certainly after she began to lose her memory, you couldn't change it, but one of the daughters had the power of attorney. And so the staff reported to one of the daughters that the husband came every day, and that, you know, they thought that he actually, you know, got in bed with her and so forth. Well, you know, we mentioned adult children before. Here's a good example. So the adult child got herself all in a state over the subject, and so she moved her mother to another home or facility. And in the second facility, she had to share a room with another woman. Well, it wasn't very long, of course. He kept came every day to see his wife, and then this lady in the other bed, she reported to the staff that in fact she heard noises, that she just knew they were having sex. And this was just a terrible thing. Well, then the staff, you know, got itself in a state, and they called the daughter, and the daughter got all beside herself, and they filed a complaint with the state saying that he was abusing his wife, that she did not have the ability to consent to having sexual relationship. Well, he said he wasn't even having sexual intercourse with her. He was laying on the bed with her, and that she initiated. She always wanted him to get into the bed with her when he came to visit. So in any event, he was prosecuted. And this was a man who was a successful businessman. He was a member of the legislature in that state, so he was not, you know, just anybody off the street. And they prosecuted him, and he won. I mean, it was a jury trial, and the jury decided, you know, this does not make sense. And a lot of experts came in, and they testified. And they testified that, in fact, people have a need for sexual touching, for sexual intimacy, as long as they live, regardless of whether every day, they can remember everything or not. But you can imagine what an ordeal that was for him, to go through, because he loved his wife and cared for his wife. He ends up having a jury trial, and so the lady who was all bent out of shape about this, in the next bed, when she came to court, of course she couldn't say what she'd actually heard. She just thought. And she was 85 years old, and so, she didn't make a very good witness for the cause. But in any event, it was a very unfortunate experience. And I think, we're sort of in danger of that sort of thing happening more often if we aren't able to do some more education of staffs of these facilities, and, help them understand that people have a right to privacy when they're in a facility. They have a right to expression of themselves, because we're all headed in that direction sooner or later. So it is really important that we know and accept the fact that people are going to have sexual interests and want to express that all of their life. And so just the fact that they go to live in assisted living doesn't change that one iota. So in any event, these are some of the places, that people are living, and some of the things that happen in those facilities that really need not happen. But part of the thing, as we were saying before, people have a hard time imagining their parent, and then some of the people who work in the facilities are very young people. And a lot of them have, I'm sure, the idea, well, these people are old, and so, what's the big deal here? Well, the big deal is that, they're still a human being, and they're still alive, and they still are entitled, to be able to express themselves sexually. As Francie said, not Francie, confused here. Tracy said, my job at the state hospice organization, and this is an area that I've been really interested in lately, is what happens, when people have chronic illnesses and are in palliative care and are at the end of life. What sorts of sexual needs do they have, and what kinds of expression, and what kinds of things do we need to know if we're caring for these people and to understand. One of the things that happens, of course, is sometimes when people are aging and certainly have chronic diseases, or their partner has chronic disease, that this does change in terms of people's desire a lot of times for some kind of a relationship. But that has more related to the disease than it does to the age. And I think that we need to be able to keep that separate and to realize that that's really what's happening. And so, we know, for example, that many of the issues that are happening in the retirement communities are really bringing up a problem that nobody really thought about. And it almost makes you think of the movie Animal House, what happens in fraternities. So you put a large group of people, very similar ages and all together. You put a longer length of life. You put Viagra into the mix, and people living healthier longer. So what do you have in retirement communities? What do you have? You've got STDs and STIs. It's an epidemic. It's really an epidemic in retirement communities particularly. Because one of the curious things that happened, you see, is that most people who are seniors now miss the memo on safe sex. And if they saw it, they didn't think it applied to them. But it did apply to them, and they didn't pay attention. And so this is really the critical issue, because you have a lot of people who have been in monogamous marriages for many, many years. Now they may be single and so forth, and they never have used condoms, for example. I don't know how to use condoms, and nobody's around there to teach them how to use condoms. I can't go everywhere, obviously, but in any event, I have to tell you, some of my youth, I trained a lot of people at Planned Parenthood, and one of the things we trained about was them teaching women how to teach their boyfriends to use condoms. So young men are not born knowing how to use condoms either, but they're teachable. And so there was a national survey on sexual health and behavior in 2010, and what it showed was that among college-age men, 40% of them always use condoms with sexual experience. Among seniors, 55 and older, only 6% use 6%. So you can see the problem here. And the thing is that we don't even talk a lot about these sexual transmitted diseases, you know. And the other fact is that some of them you don't have to have intercourse to get a sexual transmitted disease or infection. And again, I think we've had that idea, and I can remember my own experience as a social worker when I was a graduate student at the George Warren Brown School of Social Work at Washington University. I had a patient who had syphilis. Well, syphilis, you know, I mean, I had heard about that. That was really not a good word. And, but he was a very nice man. And so he had to go live in a sanatorium because he had syphilis and he had it in the last stages. And, but he was seemed very active and so forth. But I noticed that when I would go there, the nurses who were caring for him just hated him. If they ever spoke about him, they spoke about him in a really sort of derogatory way. But he was a very nice person. So I finally said to them one day, what is the problem? You know, I mean, what's the problem? I mean, he's very nice when I'm here. Does he act differently when I'm not here? Oh, no, they said. But they said, you know, we don't want to get it. And I said, well, you're not going to have sex with him, are you? And of course, they all thought it was a lost cause anyway. And I said, we don't have to, you know, we can touch him. And again, you know, before people started wearing gloves, always, you know, if you touch a person with a syphilis, with a sore and all, you can get infected with syphilis. I have to tell you the rest of the experience about that. You know, as your student, though some of your students I know, and you have lots of interesting experiences. And in any event, one day I got a call from one of the nurses there, and she said, Mr. So-and-so needs a penis clamp, and you have to go buy it, and you have to bring it to him. I thought, a penis clamp? I didn't even know what it was. And so I said, I had an office partner, Fred Weiss, I'll never forget him. And so I said to Fred Weiss, you know, my patient needs a penis clamp. Where do you even get one? He said, oh, I think a medical supply, see. And he said, I'm going to go on some home visits, and you come with me, and we'll go to the medical supply and get this, see. So I thought, oh, thank goodness for Fred Weiss and all. So anyhow, we get to the medical supply. He said, I'll go in and get it. So he stayed and came back out, and he came over, and he said, what size? What size? I said, what are you talking about? Size? What sizes are there? You know, small, medium, and large, I'll tell you if you ever need to know this and have a little conversation. And so I thought, oh, Lord. And so I thought, well, how do I know? So anyway, I called to call up the sanatorium, and I spoke to the nurse, and I said, what size? And she said, what do you mean, what size? I said, yeah, they come in sizes, you know. So anyhow, I think I bought medium. But anyhow, you know, I'll never get that case because I learned a lot. I learned about syphilis, and then I also learned about people's attitudes, you know, toward people who have syphilis and so forth. But in these retirement communities, it really has become an epidemic. And part of the problem is that healthcare professionals do not talk with people about these things. And doctors, I mean, when is your doctor, male or female, ask you about your sexual activity? You know, probably you can't even remember when, and your memory's good. You know, they don't do it. And they certainly don't do it with their older patients because, well, how can I talk to them? You know, they can't talk to people about the end of life, so they sure can't talk to them about sex. So, you know, they said, well, it's like he says about the age of my father, or you see, at the age of my mother, you know, I can't bring this up. Well, you know, they're the ones that have the medications, if you need any, and they're the ones that can write prescriptions. And so if you can't talk to them about it, it's a big problem. It's a very, very big problem. So, you know, that's why it falls to people who work in other facilities and places to actually do some sex education. The people that you come in contact with, because it's not being done by healthcare professionals. And this is one of the problems that people who have, older people who have some problems with dysfunction or whatever, they don't have anybody to talk to about it. They don't talk to their healthcare professional because they're not comfortable in bringing this up since they never bring it up. And so, you know, that's a critical thing. Another thing I wanted to talk a few minutes about is LGBT people, because and what's happening to them as they grow older. And certainly we all are aware that whole issue has become much more accepted and understood in the broader society. There still are people who are resistant to understanding it and won't understand it. But you know, these are very important issues as people age, because their needs in living in facilities and so forth are going to be different than people who are not LGBT. And so we need also to make these facilities much more aware about what these needs may be. For example, a transgendered person may need to be taking hormones the rest of his or her life. And so hormones, of course, do have some effect sometimes on your moods and so forth and so on, and might affect your behavior if you live in a facility with other people. And then the other thing that is common is that people who are couples and live in a facility can share a room. But it'd be very unusual to find a place that would let people of the same sex share a room if they come in as partners. So that's a very big problem for them. And a lot of people who are LGBT are really kind of worried about what will happen to them, you know, as they get older and as they need to go into some kind of facility. How will they be treated? Because again, many of them are still very leery, actually, even of telling healthcare professionals sometimes what their sexual preference is, sexual orientation is. And sometimes people, for example, there have been some instances where older males have been closeted all their life. And yet they will go into a nursing home, assisted living, there are other single men there, and they can develop a relationship with them, but we're never able to do that, you know, in their normal life just because of their age and the way they thought society was. So the LGBT people are going to have some special needs and do have some special needs now as they're living in these facilities. And as long as you can live in your own house, you know, you're okay. You can pretty much say who you have and what you do. But these institutionalized things are really are very different kinds of things. So again, those of you who may work in some of them, may be going to work in some of them, it's something to keep in mind. You know, we really need to do a good sexual history of people when they come into the facilities, or whenever we have them as a patient, or however we know them, you know, to ask if they're sexually active. That's all you have to ask. Are you sexually active? So yes or no, it's a simple question, you know, but you've asked the question, you know. Do you have a partner? Do you have, you know, these kinds of, they're not horrible questions to ask, you know, but somebody needs to ask the questions. Are you comfortable, you know, expressing yourself sexually? Or do you have any problems, you know? So then you can actually find out, you know, if somebody needs some help or they need some counseling or they, whatever. I notice here at the UW, they have in the School of Medicine and clinics, or I don't even know where they are, but they have some, I don't know, flyer kinds of things that exist. I don't know who they give them to or what. I've never seen anybody with one, but they told me they have them, you know, and so, you know, good for them. But the other thing is, too, that there are resources, a lot of resources that people can use. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with a store here in Madison called A Woman's Touch. and it's actually owned by a graduate of this school of social work. And but it's a very nice store, and it has really lots of good books in it. It has some clothing, it has some toys, it has vibrators, it has all kinds of interesting things. It's a very nice store, and the people there are very helpful, you know. And so there are places that, you know, I think, again, sometimes older people, if you say we go to a sex store, they think of the Red Letter place there on East Washington. I guess it's still there, was there forever, but you know, maybe it's gone. But anyhow, they think it's not a place you do. What would anybody think if they saw you going in there? You know, Lord knows. But in any event, of course, if you see them after you get in, it's okay because they're there too. But there are resources that people can use and that can make people aware about, you know, and that's okay. That's okay to go there. It's okay to buy things there that you like and so forth. Because this whole issue is, as we age, you know, it does change. Life does change and ourselves change and so forth. And as somebody has said, mouths and hands are dependable. Penises and vaginas are not. And so, you know, this is a fact of life. There are ways that you get pleasure without always having real sex. And that's what a lot of people think only intercourse, sexual intercourse, is real sex. And that's simply not the case. It's simply not the case. But if you've always thought that, and you, for example, for whatever physical reason, your illness or something you may have, you can no longer have real, quote, sex, then, you know, what do? Well, then if you don't know any other new ways, then you should visit the woman's touch store and you could learn some other things, or you can have somebody teach you, you know, some other things. I mean, just even for example, people who do have physical things, problems, and that, you know, so you don't have sex usually when you're tired. You know, if you take pain medications, take the pain medication before, you know, so that you are more comfortable. I mean, there are all of these kinds of techniques that people can explore and understand and use that enables them to continue to have pleasurable relationships and have satisfying relationships with other people. And so it's just a matter, I think, of people understanding that it's okay. You know, you're right to do this. And just because you're 70 years old or 75 years old or 85 years old, I mean, you know, well, who cares? Who cares? You know, I have a friend, for example, who is 85 years old, and she has a significant other, a male, who is 55 years old. Now, her daughter is about 55 now, and you can just imagine how that came about. This has been a relationship now 8 years. They lived together and so forth and so on. But the daughter just about had a stroke, you know, when her mother started this relationship with this younger man. Well, she called me up and was saying how she'd met him and what a wonderful, and I was a little concerned because she has a trust fund. And so I thought, I wonder if this is what this is all about. So I took myself off to meet him. And it turned out that he was a tenured professor in the university. He had his own house, he had his own car. He didn't need anybody's trust fund. But he loved her, you know, he loved her. And they've been, I think, 8 years now that they've lived together. And the daughter finally got over it because she didn't really have a choice. But, you know, age is not a big issue, you know, one way or the other. Now, we think in the society we often see older men with younger women, you know, and we think, oh, well, you know, this is just something terrible. It's not. Who cares? You know, I mean, if it suits them, it suits me. You know, I mean, this whole thing of being judgmental about, you know, somebody's only this age or not that age, or, you know, as long as they're old enough to give consent, don't worry about it. You know, I mean, it's going to be okay. I just read a very interesting article this week, and some of you may have read it too if you read this publication, but a woman was writing. She was a fundraiser, young woman fundraiser. And that this was just terrible because she felt she was being sexually harassed by older donors, men who were wealthy men, and she would meet with them to get them to, give millions to whatever the cause was. Well, some of them would say, well, they wouldn't sign the papers right away. They'd say, well, I want to think about it, and, can we have lunch, in 2 weeks or something like that? And so they kept on having more and more lunches and more. And she was considering this sexual harassment, and they'd say something like, oh, it's nice to have lunch with a pretty young woman, and so she was offended by this. And I thought, why don't you just get over this? Here this person probably feels lonely. He doesn't have, maybe opportunity to meet young people. And, he'll give 10 million one day, and maybe 3 lunches later he'll up it to 20. Who knows? But, I thought it was an interesting kind of sensitivity and lack of understanding, about probably what his needs were. And this is one of the things that you see sometimes as people age. They don't have opportunity to move about as freely now, because of limitations of one kind or where they live or something like that. And so they don't have opportunity to go out as much, etc. But in any event, I think some of her colleagues had said to her, this is the age of the person, and, this is not, he's not intentionally harassing, he's enjoying your company. But I was quite interested in how she thought differently about it. And I thought, well, you get to 20 million, maybe you'll feel better about the whole thing. But in any event, as you think about people and their aging and their needs and how hard it is. There's a fact of life. In this country, there are 26.6 million men over 55 years of age, and there are 33 million women. So this is a problem, in terms of how you match people together. And obviously some people are not heterosexuals, or you're not dealing one-on-one, but you're dealing in their areas. And so, there are more women than men. And that's just a fact. And so, now, as we were speaking earlier about some seniors getting into online dating, and this is sort of a new world, as you can imagine. And so they get online dating, and they're not used to maybe men dating a lot of different women, because they had been married for a long time, and maybe they married somebody right out of high school or college, and et cetera, et cetera. But, that's not the way it is now. And so they get very upset if if they connect with a person and they already have 2 or 3 women that they're dating. They don't like this, and they don't understand it. The whole issue of hookups, booty calls, that sort of thing, are really unusual for women who are older, and I think it may be pretty uncomfortable for some of them to understand that they might be asked to have a relationship like that. Well, I guess one of the things you could do would be to stay off of Tinder and some of those websites where that is the main function. You could get on something, I don't know what you get on, Match.com or something. But in any event, it's a different experience. And so some of them, just like this whole thing of STDs and STIs, you need to ask your sexual partner if they have an STD, if they, and certainly don't be having sex with people without using a condom. You don't know them. And but these are conversations that are not happening. They're just really not happening. And so I think what we need to do is take a billboard over on the Beltline and say, ask your partner, have you had an STD? Do you use a condom? Et cetera, and maybe spur some interest in this, and also help the epidemic, that's been going on. But in any event, it's a very, very interesting time, and it's a very interesting area to think about and to be a part of, and to know that these are the realities that people are confronting as they age, and that we all do or will confront as we age. So I've talked a long time, and I would be interested if you have questions. I specialize in simple questions, or if you have comments or anything from your own experiences or work experiences to share. Yeah, Tracy, yeah.
So I know when I worked as a hospice social worker, sometimes well, no, I take it back. It was when I was doing research because I could not, you know, interact with the person as a client. But they would talk about part of their unhappiness with their dying process was that they weren't having sex.
Yeah.
So if a social worker assesses someone and sexual issue, what would you recommend that the social worker do in terms of, you know, who would that be that they would make the recommendation to? Because maybe it's not that a man is having any kind of erectile dysfunction. It's more of how he can do it with pain, etc.
Yeah, well, I think if if you're a social worker working with older people, you ought to know some of these things yourself. You know, in terms of what can you do for erectile dysfunction. I wouldn't necessarily refer them to a doctor because probably won't get much help. But I think to make yourself knowledgeable about it. And if people are in a terminal situation and they have a spouse or a partner, you need to spend time with both of them, because that other person, I think, again, if someone is terminally ill, the partner might think, well, this is not appropriate, or it's not, that's not going to be a good thing for them. But ask them, would you like for me to get in bed with you? Would you like to just cuddle with me? Or, whatever that would make them feel good and make them feel desired and that sort of thing. Obviously, sometimes when we have surgeries, we have to have surgeries. We may have a missing part or something. It makes you feel, about that. There are partners, a lot of them, I think, who are very accepting, of these changes that happen with a spouse, either way. But people do want to be intimate as long as they live. And one of the things we know in the dying process is that the need for touch stays with us as long as we live. Just to be touched and caressed and that sort of thing. Know that somebody's there with you. Know that somebody's kind and wants to be with you. I mean, that is a very comforting thing at the end of life. And, I really have felt sad sometimes when I've seen situations where nobody touches the person who's in bed. Now, sometimes if people are in ICUs, they've got, machines and all that kind of thing, but they still have got some parts that are not attached to a machine. Their arms or their legs or something that you can touch, and that means an awful lot to the patient and also to you, because if you are not the terminal person, you're a partner of a terminal, you also still need to have a connection to that person as long as you can. So, it really is something that you need to talk with the partner about too, and have them understand it's okay, and that this is something that the person needs. Yeah. Any other question or comment? Or yes, Francie.
I'm glad you mentioned the touch, because I think that when we talk about sex, we can't forget the cuddle factor, the intimacy that people need. And I think it's an interesting phenomenon in recent years. A lot of retirement communities that deal with aging as well as others have incorporated massage therapists in their facilities, so people can be touched, and the need for privacy. But I bet I'm not the only one here who has this question, and that is, what is a penis clamp?
Well, a lot of times when you have syphilis or something, you have a dripping, a leakage. And so a penis clamp was actually, at that time, I don't know if they exist now, but anyway, it was made out of soft plastic. It was almost like a condom, and you put over the penis, and so if the penis was dripping, that's what it was. I learned it myself.
Because I wrote down, check what a penis clamp.
There'll be a big run on them.
Have a stupid question, it's usually not a stupid question.
I tell my students.
Well, and the whole thing too about oral sex, this is something that doesn't go away, when you age. But again, in terms of STDs and things like that, you need to be careful. There are dental dams that are called dental dams that you can put in your mouth or whoever, and so that you don't swallow the semen. And all these things are available and also important, because it's like I said, the hands in the mouth are reliable. The penis and the vagina are not, and that's something to remember. And so as we age, we use other ways of feeling good and of having sexual pleasure. Yeah.
Well, but don't you think that the lack of use of condoms is more that people think, well, there's no problem in getting pregnant now?
Yeah,
so I
exactly.
can do it.
Exactly. That's exactly. And they never had
Not
used them.
ignorance of the
Yeah,
fact.
no, but they had never used them before. They never used them before. And people who are in their 70s and all now have never used them before.
I
And
doubt that.
yeah, but in any
People in
event.
their 70s now were pretty hip in the 60s, I would think.
Well, the other thing is that the national study showed that men who use Viagra were a lot less usually didn't use condoms almost at all. That somehow or another had the idea that Viagra protected them and all, but clearly it does not. It does not. The other thing about Viagra is that some of the stuff that's coming out is when there's a memory loss or dementia. Sometimes Viagra really acts quite dramatically in that system, and it may cause the person to become quite aggressive and quite strong and so forth, and so this can be a bit of a problem. So people need to know that, and sometimes the partners need to know that this is really the problem, that Viagra doesn't act the same way in everybody. So in any event, I think my time is up, and I'm sure that you think so too. So anyway, thank you for coming. It's been nice to be here. Yeah.